Gorilla in the Guest Room by Gerald Durrell. A highly acclaimed British naturalist happens to be the author of Gorilla in the Guest Room. In fact, he has many feathers to add to his cap, like he is a devoted watcher of the natural world, an eloquent communicator on animal matters, a TV presenter, and many more things. He observed the animals, their habits and habitats, and it was this interest that helped him in his creative energy. And the most important thing to know about the author was that he was passionate about preservation, about the protection, about the conservation of animals. And what is this story about? You would be surprised to know that all of Gerald's stories are about his real encounters and his experiences with wildlife. In fact, I would call them as first hand experiences, making the text Gorilla in the Guest Room more authentic in nature. Now, this story happens to be a story that revolves around Daryl's establishment of a zoo. So, the storyline or the plot is a beautiful bond or a unique relationship of our author with uh, Pongo. In fact, N here should be silent, so you can call it Pongo. So, the story is about Pongo's relationship, and and it happens to be a pet gorilla. So the story is not only about human and animal bond, but it is more about conservation of wildlife. Interestingly, something that as students we would love to see Gerald portraying his animals and the nature of these animals very much like humans. So, if we talk about Cheryl's writing style, then it is unassuming, sometimes mocking, and a very graceful writing style which would impress us as readers. What impresses us in this story is definitely, as discussed earlier, this love, this bond that is brilliantly expressed and portrayed, and portrayed, wherein we see Pongo and Gerald being more as friends, or I would say more like brothers. And this portrayal is something which is worth reading his story. Obviously, we don't come across a very stereotyped portrayal of a master and a pet kind of relationship that we see it very often around us, but this is a unique bond to be explored in this story. Background of the story: the entire setting of the story is in Jersey, the largest of the Channel Islands between England and France. And something noteworthy to know is that it is at this place, that is Jersey, that Gerald's famous zoo, that is Jersey Zoo, which was earlier known as Darrell Wild Park, is located. So the major part of the story is set at this zoological park at Jersey, where Pongo is brought to by Gerald. And however, the story starts with a discussion that happens in a room in the animal shelter of the Royal Society for the Preservation of Cruelty to Animals, and it is at this place that the author meets Pongo for the first time. Title of the story: the title is simple, direct, and suggestive. In fact, it prepares the readers for an exciting situation where a gorilla would be treated and taken care of as a guest. Generally, if we talk about gorillas, then it is not expected to be staying in a house with rooms, but in a place open to nature. Pongo was supposed to stay in his cage in a zoo, no doubt about that. But unfortunately, as the cage wasn't prepared, wasn't ready, it had to, in fact, the author had to keep him in a guest room. So, despite his previous unpleasant experience of keeping a chimpanzee Chumley in his house, there is a reference that the author later gives, Gerald decides to keep Pongo in his guest room for a few days. So we know that Darrell had, dedicated his life to establish a zoo that would conserve wildlife, especially those he was more concerned about species that were threatened with extinction. So, in this story, we see that to obtain a baby gorilla, even if he had financial issues, obtaining this baby gorilla becomes his priority. So, this story gives us an opportunity to get an inside view of the rigor, of the care, the considerations that go into making of such a noble task of saving the endangered species. The form and the structure of the story. The story is narrated by the author himself, so he happens to be a very important character in this story. The story gets quite entertaining. In fact, it's very informative as well, as we get to know a lot of things about these animals and their behavior. Uh, I would not be wrong to say we can call it a semi autobiographical naturalist account. If we talk about language, very in fact simple style with no twist, lucid, eloquent. It's very direct with a lot of descriptions, making the story more vivid and interesting. Eco criticism. And what it means is to evaluate a literary text from the perspective of ecology. What it tries to do is to find out, in fact, this process is to find out a particular text that raises concerns over conservation of ecological issues like unwise exploitation of natural resources, or it could be deforestation issues or extinction of endangered species, it could be global warming, among others. So, by the example of portrayal of gorillas in this story, the author wants the readers to empathize with other endangered species who are on the verge of extinction. So, gorillas that are used here are just a symbol, I would say, a representation. So, this is how the story also testifies, it also affirms the author's own belief that zoos should diligently work for the conservation of wildlife.